So what was it like for you when World War II was declared?
Well, the war broke out on September the 3rd, 1939. I was 10 years old at that point. And during the month of August, the clouds of war had gathered. And there was constant talk of war in the papers, on the radio. Everyone was consumed with the fact that the war looked like it was inevitable. So what the government decided to do, because Portsmouth was a big naval base and was vulnerable to bombing, they decided to, if war was declared, they would evacuate all the school children. So at the end of August, we had a rehearsal, and every school child in Portsmouth went down to the railway station. They had special buses, and we all lined up when we got down there, and this, that, the other. And so that was like the rehearsal. Now, we didn't quite know quite what to expect, when the war broke out. So since my parents had decided not to evacuate us, they decided that, they spoke to, there's a row of hills along the south coast, and Portsmouth, of course, is on the seaside of it, and they have friends on the other side of the downs, on the other side. So they arranged, and we actually went out to them. Their name was Keylock, and we went and stayed with them. Now this was September the 1st, just before the war broke out, and they thought they'd be safe away from this naval base. Now, you have to, I'm going to tell you what happened on September the 3rd. On September the 3rd, the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, got on the radio and announced to the nation that England was now at war with Germany. Now, there had been talk in the papers about the Germans going into Czechoslovakia and some of these other countries before they went into Poland, and how they had looted and raped women. I think it was actually exaggerated, actually. In fact, I'm sure it didn't, but anyway, that's what was going around at the time. So on September the 3rd, Roy, that was the Keylock's boy, and myself went out to play. And when we got back, it was about 11:30 roundabout then, we went into the kitchen and we heard our parents, there were 2 or 3 women there, talking. And I heard my mother say, well, when they come, I'm going to put the kids' my head in the gas oven. We're not going to be alive when they get here. I'm not going to go through that. So here you are, 10 years old, and that's what you hear.
And you knew what that meant. You knew that meant suicide and murder.
Yeah, curtains. I was a bit startled because we didn't even know about war broke out because you're 10, you're not following all this stuff.
Well, and hearing those types of words out of your mother's mouth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, after about 2 weeks, nothing happened. There were no bombing or anything, so we moved back to Portsmouth. And when we got back, all the children had been evacuated and all the schools were closed. And they closed for about a year.
Wow.
And then at the end of the year, because there was only a few pupils left there, you see, but we didn't have any school, so they started school after a year, but only half days. So half the class went in the morning and half went in the afternoon. And now, to carry on with the story, my dad was in the submarine service, and he had been in the submarine service for 4 years at this point in 1939. Very experienced submariner. So he was seconded to a submarine where it was a training submarine. So the crews would get some instruction on land, and then they'd have to be blooded and go on a submarine and actually work under conditions. And
They call that being blooded?
Yeah. It means to go into war.
Oh.
Going into action.
Okay.
Going into action. So, so what they would do at the end of the instruction on land, they would then go on a submarine with an experienced crew, and they would be instructed on actual conditions, and that's what my dad did. And they would go over to the German coast and control up and down the German coast for 2 weeks.
With these trainees?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then come back and have 2 weeks leave, and then they would go 2 weeks and then again. So,
with the same
yeah,
crew?
with different crew.
Oh, different crew.
Yeah. So 2 weeks at sea, 2 weeks coming back. In the meantime, the bombing was started. And the siren would go and we'd have to go down in the shelter. Now, the shelter was in the backyard. And it was interesting the way it got there, because just before the war broke out, they decided to put air raid shelters at every house in the garden.
Oh, that was installed for you?
Yeah.
Wow.
So they started at one end of the row of houses, and they had to do it by hand. They didn't have mechanical things.
Right.
They would dig it down about 4 feet, and then they would put it in. It was made of metal, and it was shaped like an arch like that. So 4 feet would be in the ground, and the top would be up. Then they put the earth that they took out onto the top.
Mm.
Anderson Shelters was the name. Now, when the air raid warning came, you had to go down into the air raid shelter until the all clear. The all clear, they had a siren for the all clear. It had different sounds, you know. Mm-hmm. And my earliest memories of childhood was being woken up in the middle of the night to go to the shelter. My mother would come in with a flashlight, and we would be deep in sleep. You know how it's like when you're a kid, you sleep.
Solid.
Would, come on, we got to go down the shelter. And in the winter, there'd be 2 or 3 inches of water in the sea. Now we had planks.
Oh, in the bottom of the shelter.
Yeah, we'd have planks. But you just got out of a warm bed, you put a blanket around you and you go down. It was pretty bloody awful, And I didn't know this. All I knew was we were always seen to be going down the shelters. And it wasn't till about 15 or 20 years ago, I was in a store, and in a bookstore. And they had a book there of towns of England. So I looked up Portsmouth, and I learned that in the first year of the war, we had 1,000 air raids.
Wow.
That's about roughly 3 a day.
Yeah.
Now, we didn't get bombed every time. What the thing was is if a convoy came down the English Channel and the planes took off, they didn't know whether they were going to bomb the convoy or the naval base. So they would say no warning. So I would say that of the 1,000, there's probably only a third of those when they actually dropped bombs.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, Dad would go for these 2 weeks on the submarine off the German coast. Now, we would get bombed, and when the crew came back, and remember there were no phones in those days, they would come back to go home, and quite often the street where their house was bombed.
Really?
So an air raid warden would come up and say, "Are you able Seaman Jenkins?" And he'd say, "Yes. I'm sorry to tell you, but your house was bombed, and your wife is dead, and young Jimmy is over at your sister's." And that sort of thing went on. Well, it got to the point after 18 months, my dad came home, and he said, "I'm fed up with this." He says, "I go away for 2 weeks. You don't know if I'm coming back. I come back, and I don't know whether you're going to be there. So he said, evacuate. So we didn't. We evacuated as a family, just my mother and the two boys, and we went. We had 3 or 4 different stops around Britain till the end of the war. We actually ended up in Belfast, in Ireland, at the end of the war.
So was that the place that you were the longest, or you have the most memories of, or?
No,
No.
we went there in the end of 1943, I think it was, to Ireland, and it was kind of interesting because Belfast, which is in Northern Ireland, was, for those days with the type of aircraft that they had, it was a long way from Germany.
Okay.
So when we got there, I wasn't expecting to see any war damage. My goodness me, that downtown of Belfast was devastated, block after block. I couldn't
Really?
believe it. They only have had one air raid during the war.
They only had one air
One
raid.
air raid, and they plastered the place. Yeah, so
But that was when you got there.
yeah,
The
this
damage
is
was
yeah,
done.
1943. This is afterwards. Yeah.
And where were you living in Belfast?
Well, we lived in what was called Mount Pottinger, and we lived in lodgings there,
Okay.
and we had 2 rooms in a house. Now, I say lodgings. We did have a stove, so we did our own cooking. But there was 3 or 4 different people in there. You know, there was another couple plus a couple of single guys in this big house.
Right. Were you in the urban center or in the
Yeah,
country?
in the just off of just on the outskirts of downtown.
And how long would you have been there for?
About 18 months, 2 years.
Oh wow, so
Yeah,
quite a long
yeah.
time. And you said, what year? How old would you have been at that point?
I was 14, I think, when I went there.
Okay, so you remember that fairly well then.
Yeah, I do. I remember. You know, to get to Northern Ireland, you have to catch a ferry. Now, remember I told you about the bike?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we get up to this place where the ferry goes, Stanyard, I think it was called, and we were up on the boat. We got on the boat and we were watching them loading, and they were taking the luggage, and you know, in like nets with a crane, and it was going into the hold, and we were watching it going into the hold. Well, this thing came down loaded, and there's my bike. I said, "There's my bike," and just as I said it, it fell off and was smashed.
Oh, no.
We waited months for that thing and paid a small fortune for it.
And it smashed on
That's
the
right.
boat or in the water? Or?
No, it was in the boat, and it fell
Broke.
down into the hold.
Oh,
Yeah, so anyway, that's it.
all right.